Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you that starting in January of 2024, videos in this series are no longer going to be posted on Now Let's Be Honest. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start posting those videos on a different YouTube channel, which I just launched, which is just called by my name, David Tate. So if you're wanting some more laid-back, informal, long-form content like the stuff that you've been watching right here on this channel, you can go to that channel and subscribe to it there, because I'm going to try to keep this channel, Now Let's Be Honest, more focused on the stuff that I explicitly made for YouTube. So if you're here for this type of Bible study thing, go to that channel, subscribe to that. That's where this stuff is going to be starting in January of 2024. That being said, let's get to the stuff you're actually here for. Thank you for allowing us to be here today, God. Thank you for your word. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for everything that you have done, you are doing, and you will do. May your spirit be with us, guiding us into understanding as we go into your word tonight. And may we learn to succeed where Solomon failed. We love you, God. We praise you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so I made this announcement to y'all before we prayed, but we are also recording this, and so I need to make an announcement to the people who are watching this online. First and foremost, this is the last Bible study of this year, because next year we are going to be having our annual Christmas party here at the Tate household, and so we will not be here for Bible study. Instead, we will just be enjoying some fellowship, and so this will be the last Bible study for the year. And secondly, and this is probably the more important announcement for those of y'all watching online, this is going to be the last time you see this Bible study on this YouTube channel. Because if we're meeting next year, well, starting in January, I'm going to be uploading these Bible studies on a different YouTube channel, and you can find the link to that channel in the description down below. And I probably already put a video ahead of this whole video announcing that. But I just want to give you a heads up. Whenever we go into 1 Kings chapter 12, that will be on a different YouTube channel. And so if you're wondering why they all of a sudden stopped, that is why they stopped on this channel, right? Because I'm moving them all to that channel starting in January. That being said, 1 Kings chapter 11. I also made this announcement to y'all ahead of time, but we are going to cover the whole chapter 11 today. We did cover the first few verses last week, but we were really looking at those verses as a conclusion to what we talked about in chapter 10. Now what we're going to do is we're going to re-examine those verses, probably a little bit more briefly, but we're going to look at them as an introduction to the stuff that happens in chapter 11, right? And the way I'm going to set this whole thing up is actually by reading to you two different verses from the book of Deuteronomy. Right? The Deuteronomy is in the section of Scripture that we would know as the Torah, right? And before I read that, maybe I should just recap some context for us real quick. Where we're at in the story of Solomon is really what we're covering today is the end of King Solomon's reign. By the end of this chapter, Solomon will be dead, right? 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11 is Solomon's story. And sadly, it's a story about how Israel reached its peak and then fell apart dramatically. We got to see how it began to fall apart in chapter 9. We saw its rapid decline in chapter 10, and then in chapter 11, we're going to see the enemies that God raises up to destroy Solomon, right? This is the united monarchy, after the people got out of Egypt, and they came through the wilderness, and they got through the period of the judges in the promised land. You have this united monarchy where there was King Saul, King David, and King Solomon, right? King Solomon is at the end of his reign right here, and things are about to get really, really bad. And I think that works out where we're going to end this at the end of this year, so that starting in next year, we're going to begin looking at the divided kingdom, which really takes us through the end of 1 Kings and into through the rest of 2 Kings as well, right? So starting next year, we're going to look at the entire divided kingdom. So before we get into that, I want us to look in Deuteronomy into the Torah, where God is giving his instructions to the people of Israel to guide them going forward, and really just giving them the rules for how they're supposed to conduct themselves. This is what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 20. You shall fear Yahweh your God, you shall serve him and cling to him, and you shall swear by his name. Right? I want you to remember that word cling. Right? You shall cling to Yahweh. Right? That's what Israel is supposed to do. You shall cling to him. Whenever you think of clinging to somebody, what imagery comes to your mind?
Like tightly hugging them?
Tightly hugging them. Who is this, if you're going to be clinging to somebody, who are you usually going to be clinging to?
Someone that you're close to?
Someone you're close to, but this is more wife-husband imagery, right? It's the imagery of spouses, right? You cling to your spouse, right? Think Song of Solomon, right? Like the imagery, like that the woman constantly goes to, and her young friends, because she's not married yet, her friends have to tell her, don't arouse her awake in love before it pleases, is that her man is clinging to her, right? It's spousal imagery. Well, in Deuteronomy, God says, you shall cling to me, right? You go to chapter 11, and I believe it's verse 22 I'm wanting. Yes. Verse 22, it says, for if you are careful to keep all his commandment, which I am commanding you to do, to love Yahweh your God, to walk in all his ways, and to hold fast to him, then Yahweh will drive out all these nations from before you, and you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you. Right? So not only are they called to cling to Yahweh, but there's a promise that if they hold fast to him, then God will give them victory over their enemies. Right? The imagery is that if they treat God as a spouse, and if they are faithful to him, as a spouse is supposed to be faithful to another spouse, then God is going to destroy their enemies before them, and they will have victory even over nations that are mightier than them. Right? It's all about their faithfulness to God. If they are faithful to him, as a spouse should be faithful. Right? Remember the word cling. Remember the phrase hold fast. Right? Now, let's go, and we're going to read the first 8 verses of chapter 11. And last week, we read them under one particular light, right? Which also tied back to Deuteronomy, right? If you remember Deuteronomy chapter 17, there were 3 things that the law prohibited kings multiplying, right? They were not supposed to multiply money, right? They weren't supposed to multiply wealth. They weren't supposed to multiply horses. They weren't supposed to multiply armies and stuff like that. And they weren't supposed to multiply women, right? And what we saw at the end of chapter 10 and going into the beginning of chapter 11 is that Solomon multiplied all those 3 things, right? And so the reason why we covered all of those last week is because I wanted to show you that he checkmarked all the 3 things kings are not supposed to do, right? And so, according to Deuteronomy chapter 17, Solomon is now officially a bad king, which is really sad because this is the guy who dedicated the temple of God and did all this stuff, right? Now, though, I want us to look at this in a different light. Instead of looking at this as simply Solomon being the bad king, talked about in Deuteronomy chapter 17, I want us to look at the broader implications of how Solomon is not simply a bad king, he's a bad Israelite, right? Because according to Deuteronomy chapter 10 and 11 and other places in Deuteronomy, I just gave some examples, Israel is called to cling to Yahweh. And I want you to notice who Solomon clings to instead, right? And so read those verses for me, please.
Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which Yahweh had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not go along with them, nor shall they go along with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love, and he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. Now it happened at the time that Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to Yahweh his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. And Solomon did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and did not follow Yahweh fully, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods.
Perfect. Thank you. So, who were the Israelites supposed to cling to? Yahweh. Who does Solomon cling to?
Foreign women.
Foreign women, right? Verse 2. Solomon clung to these in love, right? Once again, it's the imagery of a spouse, right? The issue is, God told them not to do this, right? And first off, he told them generally not to do this amongst any of the foreign women, right? That was Deuteronomy 17. But if you go back to Exodus chapter 23, God specifically mentions a lot of these particular women, right, in the group. And then I think if you go once again back to Deuteronomy, I believe it is, he says that there are certain people who are not permitted to enter the assembly. And some of these women, like those specific people, are the ones that are mentioned. Right? But for the Exodus 23 reference, he talks about a lot of these different people groups right here. He's talking about He says, my angel will go before you and bring you into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Right? And it begins to say a lot of stuff about them. The Hivites, the Canaanites, the Hittites. Keeps talking about them. But if you get down to the very end of the chapter, it says, you shall make no covenant with them or with their gods. They shall not live in your land, because they will make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. Right? That's what this is referencing whenever it says, from the nations concerning which Yahweh had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not go along with them, nor shall they go along with you. Right? It's referencing Exodus chapter 23. Right? So the author of 1 Kings recognizes that what Solomon's doing is breaking the law in many different ways. It's breaking Deuteronomy chapter 17. It's breaking Deuteronomy chapter 10. It's breaking Deuteronomy chapter 11. It's breaking Exodus chapter 23. I mean, you don't have to read that far into the law to get to Exodus 23, because you know when God starts delivering the law? Exodus chapter 20. Right? I mean, you're just a few chapters into the law at that point. Right? And so Solomon is breaking all of this stuff, and he is choosing to cling to foreign women, and as a result of this, the kingdom is going to be divided. Right? Can you think of anybody else in Israel's history who clung to a woman he was not supposed to, and as a result, the kingdom was punished? David, Solomon's dad. Right? To be fair, Bathsheba, as far as we know, was not a foreign woman. We do know that her husband was. Right? Her husband was actually a Hittite. Right? Which is one of the people in this group. But that's not the issue, right? Because Uriah the Hittite, he was a follower of Yahweh. And Bathsheba apparently was also, right? So that wasn't the issue with David. The issue with David was that she was married. And David already had a bunch of other wives, right? And so that was really the issue there. But if you think about it, David clung to another woman. And as a result, the kingdom was divided, right? Because afterwards, remember, you had Absalom who rose up and led this coup. And then there was this whole division in the kingdom. But out of God's mercy, the kingdom wasn't fully divided. But remember how even at the end of 2 Samuel, we started seeing that divide introduced more and more, to where people were turning against the people of Judah, and there started to be this greater division between Judah down here and the rest of the tribes up there. Do y'all remember that?
Yeah.
So we got to see this foreshadowed with David, right? David clings to a woman, the kingdom is divided. Well, Solomon doesn't just cling to one woman. He clings to 700 wives and 300 concubines. And so now the kingdom will fully be divided. Right? And so I want to just highlight this, because not only does this section here hit put the nail in the coffin of Solomon's failure as a king, but it also shows how he failed to do what Israel was called to do in general. Right? Not only did he fail as the leader of the Israelites, he failed as an Israelite, just any Israelite. Right? Another thing I want to highlight here, right? I know I'm talking a lot, and then we'll actually just walk through it verse by verse again, and we'll go a little bit briefer through it. But in verse 4, now it happened at the time that Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to Yahweh his God, as the heart of David his father had been. First off, what word do you see repeated there a whole lot?
Devoted?
No.
Hearts.
Heart.
Hard.
Heart. You see it several times in verse 4, and if you keep reading through this passage, the word heart shows up a whole lot. If you haven't noticed, there's a big theology of the heart taking place throughout 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Right? If you go back to 1 Samuel, what was it that set David apart from every other man?
A man after God's own heart.
He was a man after God's own heart. Right? Whenever Solomon was asking God for wisdom, do you remember what he wanted?
Discerning heart.
He wanted a hearing heart,
Yeah.
right? He wanted a heart that hears, right? And just in the last chapter, in chapter 10, Sheba was praising Solomon, and we got to see that God gave Solomon a wise heart, right? The heart is the thing that matters. Yet here we see that Solomon's heart is not wholly devoted to God. Another thing worth noting, the word wholly devoted there. In Hebrew, this is one word, and the word is closely related to the word shalom, right? It's the word shalom, right? Which is interesting because shalom and shalom, they have one thing super in common whenever it comes to the name Solomon. They're spelt basically the same, right? And so whenever it says that he was not wholly devoted to Yahweh his God, as his father David had been, in many ways it's saying that he was not Solomon to Yahweh, right? So in not being wholly devoted to Yahweh, Solomon ceased to be Solomon, right? He was not Shalom to Yahweh, and therefore Shlomo was no longer Shlomo, right? Shlomo is the Hebrew name for Solomon, right? So this is one of the cool things. I just like to highlight that stuff in Hebrew because we translate it differently because we're trying to communicate it in English, but there's that extra level of depth if you read it in the original languages because Hebrew, like, they had, like just the way they wrote stuff was differently, and they didn't have vowels originally, right? So the context determined the word. And so when you're reading it, it's the same letters that you would use to express peace, or you would use to express Solomon, because that's what Solomon's name means. But the context is talking about being wholly devoted, right? But it's really saying Solomon was no longer Solomon anymore, right? The thing that made Solomon who he was, the thing that made Solomon the Prince of Peace, was him being wholly devoted to God. But now that these women have turned him away, Solomon is no longer Solomon, right? He's become something different. He's become something other than what God intended for him. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Let's walk through this really quickly, and then we'll get to the new material. Sound good? All right. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, right? So we talked about the daughter of Pharaoh way back in chapter 3, I think it was, where it talked about him being married to her. Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which Yahweh had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not go along with them, nor shall they go along with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. One thing that's also worth highlighting here is that when you actually examine the scriptures that it's quoting, it doesn't say that you shall not go along with them. It says that you shall not marry them. This is an interpretive choice on the part of the author here, because they're interpreting what God is meaning by that, right? God is not simply restricting marriage. He's restricting any form of relationship that would lead to you following after their gods, right? And so God specifically prohibits marriage, but it's not the marriage itself that it's sinful. It is the following after other gods that is sinful, right? And so marriage is the relationship that is guaranteed to do that, but really any sort of relationship that would lead you to follow after their gods, that's prohibited, right? So you shall not go along with them. Solomon clung to these in love. Is there anything y'all want to highlight in those verses that maybe sticks out to you that you think is worth addressing?
Like verse 1?
Verses 1 through 2. Both of those.
I was just going to add to what you said.
Okay.
I don't know about add to it, but is that also kind of, not calling back to, but when Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount talks about with the heart and you shall not, it's been said you shall not commit adultery. Mm-hmm. It's is it kind of the same thing there? It's it's not just the marriage. It's
well, yeah, it's really trying to get to the heart of the law, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of commandments in the law where God says don't do this, but he doesn't give an explanation for why.
Yeah.
That's one of those commandments where he does give an explanation, right? You shall not marry them because they will lead you to follow after other gods. So God explains why they're not supposed to marry them. And so what you see the author doing here is he's doing what Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount. He is interpreting the heart behind the commandment, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just the marriage. It is the nature of a relationship that will lead you away. So
the issue doesn't begin right when you marry them.
Exactly. Yeah. Anything else y'all want to highlight there? So that is a good connection. There's a lot of stuff in this chapter that can point us directly towards the words of Jesus, which is really fun. All right. Verse 3. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. Wow, there's the word heart again, right? They'll turn your heart away after their gods. His wives turned his heart away. Even Solomon, the wisest man in the world, was not exempt to the promises of God. God said, if you marry these women, your heart will be turned away. And I bet we can all know exactly how Solomon was thinking. Solomon was probably thinking, well, I'm the exception to the rule. I'm the wisest man on earth. God's wisdom has been with me thus far. I bet I can. That probably applies to everybody else. But God gave me this wisdom to produce a peaceful land. I'm sure God would be okay with me doing this, right? And I'm probably wise enough to avoid the temptation. No. Right? That's not how it works. Right? Even Solomon, the wisest man on the earth, the most important man in God's current covenantal plan, even he was not exempt from this. As God promised, so it is. God said they turn your hearts away, and so in one verse, his wives turned his heart away. Now it happened at that time, Solomon was old. His wives turned his heart away. Look at that. There's the word heart again. After other gods. And his heart was not wholly devoted to Yahweh his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Notice again, it's not just actions it's talking about here. It's the heart. Right? We don't know the nature of Solomon's actions. We're going to see that he builds temples and stuff like that. But I imagine that in Solomon's eyes, he probably was still a worshiper of Yahweh. Right? He just added other gods to the list. Right? And he probably still viewed himself as primarily a worshiper of Yahweh. Right? He still made God first in line. But that's not what God wanted. He wanted you to be wholly devoted. Right? It's kind of like if you were married and your spouse decided to, still run around with her old boyfriends. You'd be like, well, honey, that's not how it works. And she's like, well, you got to understand. You're the one I stood across from at the altar. You're the one I come home to every night. You're the one who I'm raising children with. These are just side pieces. Are you going to be happy with that as a husband? No. You're going to be like, this is ridiculous. I didn't ask to just be your main person. I wanted to be your only person. That's what God wants, right? He wants whole devotion, not simply first in line. So he was not wholly devoted as his father David had been. So David was more of a Solomon than Solomon was, right? Solomon was for a time because he was wholly devoted, right? For Solomon went after Ashtoreth and the goddess of the Sidonians and Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. And Solomon did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh and did not follow Yahweh fully, as David his father had done. You have this repeated emphasis on David, right? For some time, Solomon had the potential of bringing in this new glory years. But instead, by the time Solomon reaches the end of his reign, they're forced to look backwards on the glory years of David. They thought they were living on the edge of prosperity, but it turns out that the height of prosperity had died 40 years ago with David. That's sad. They had thought that things were crumbling at the time of David, but it wasn't. Right? Things might not have been as good physically speaking, but spiritually speaking, David was a powerhouse. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, on the Mount of Olives, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. So he builds altars on the Mount of Olives, the very place where Jesus is going to ascend to heaven, the very place where Jesus is going to raise Lazarus from the dead, the very place where Jesus is going to enter into Jerusalem on a donkey, the very place where Jesus is going to return one day. Solomon builds pagan temples there. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. This is a very sad way to end Solomon's story here. And I hate to break it to you, Solomon only has a few verses left. He's going to live until the end of this chapter, and we're never going to see a moment of repentance from Solomon. I pray to God that Ecclesiastes was written after this stuff happened. I really do. I hope that Ecclesiastes is Solomon's repentance, but the author doesn't mention that. And I think there's a reason why the author doesn't mention it. Because even if Solomon repented, that's not what the author wants to focus on. The author wants to focus on the dangers of sin, right? And Solomon's repentance would be a beautiful thing, but it would distract from the story that's about to unfold, right? And so I pray Solomon did repent. I pray that that's what we read about in Ecclesiastes, but we don't know, right? If anything, sadly, Ecclesiastes could be the story of a guy who knew better, but still chose not to repent. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, he says at the end. But he's probably thinking, I'm an old guy, and maybe it's too late for me now. I don't know. I hope he repented. But there's verses 1 through 8. Do y'all have anything y'all want to add to our discussion on this before we go into the rest of the chapter? Cool. All right. Let's go into verses 9 through 13. Take it away.
Now Yahweh was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from Yahweh, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not walk after other gods. But he did not keep what Yahweh had commanded. So Yahweh said to Solomon, because this has happened with you, you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you. So I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days, for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son, for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen.
Bada boom, bada bing. Okay, so what do we see happen here?
God's punishment to Solomon because he did not follow his covenant with God.
Yeah. We get to see God's punishment, right? You play stupid games, you receive stupid prizes. Were you going to say something else?
Yes, it mentions in 2 Solomon,
2 Samuel.
2 Samuel. Thanks. He tells David that he kept his covenant, so he will have his kingdom will continue.
Mm-hmm.
It mentions that his kingdom will still continue even if your descendants mess up. So you can see in this verse, even though Solomon messed up, he still gave him one kingdom, even though.
Yeah. Yeah, this is one thing, like, I think these few verses right here, like, are a good example of why I get so frustrated whenever people say that the Old Testament God is so mean and he's just a jerk. I don't think they're reading the same Old Testament that I am.
He could have done much worse.
He could have. He could say, you know what? Forget that covenant I made. I'm done with y'all. And he has every right to do that. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't, right? I mean, what we see here is we see a perfect blend of, like, judgment and fury, but also mercy and grace and hesed, right? We see both of those acting at the same time, right? And what's interesting is that they're both fueled by God's anger, right? It doesn't say he was angry but also compassionate. He said he was angry and he said this, right? And so he's angry, and from that anger flows punishment, but God's anger does not cause him to forget his promises, which our anger often does, right? Oftentimes we will make a promise to somebody until they make us angry, and then we'll just say, forget the promise. God does not do that, right? Even whenever he's angry, he is faithful to his covenant. Let's walk through it. Now Yahweh was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from Yahweh, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. I think it's really interesting that it just keeps emphasizing heart. Just because, like I said, we see that he's building temples and stuff. We don't know what he's doing with his actions that demonstrate his evil, right? We don't know how much the general public knew about Solomon's apostasy and turning to other idols. We don't know about that, right? And we don't know if Solomon turned to a bunch of wickedness and stuff like that. All we know is that his heart turned away. But if you go back to 1 Samuel, man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks to the heart. Right? So for all we know, Solomon looked like the most righteous and amazing king, and everybody thought the world of him. But God knew his heart. Right? I'm not saying that is the case, but I'm saying that that's all it takes. So it keeps emphasizing his heart. Right? Whereas with later kings, it'll say God saw all the evil that they were doing. It doesn't say that with Solomon. It just says that it was evil in the sight of the Lord. Well, God sees the heart. Right? And so it doesn't have to be external evil. It can simply be internal evil of the heart, and God sees it and he's mad. And remember, this is the God who is slow to anger. Right? He's long of nose. Now Yahweh was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from Yahweh, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing. I think there's 3 reasons right there that show why God is mad. Right? What is the first one?
He commanded him?
Well, even before then.
Turn his heart away.
Well, yes, but there's 3 primary crimes that he committed by turning his heart away.
I know the first one. Because he appeared to him twice.
Oh, that's the second one, actually.
What?
The first one's right before it.
Heart was turned away?
What was Solomon's biggest issue? He turned away from Yahweh, who was what?
The God of Israel.
The God of Israel! Right? I mean, it'd be one thing if you're like a pagan, like, if you're a Gentile turning away from Yahweh, that's almost expected. Right? If a Sidonian or a Moabite turns away from Yahweh, well, honestly, it was impressive they were worshiping Yahweh to begin with. But Solomon, he is the king of Israel. And now he is worshiping a God who is not Israel's God. Like, this is unheard of. This is weird. Right? I mean, that's one of the craziest things about the story of the people of Israel. Is that the God who made everything chose them to be his people, yet they are like the least faithful. Like, you don't usually see the Canaanites turning away from Baal. Like, usually they're pretty faithful to Baal, right? And the Philistines are pretty faithful to Dagon, right? But for some reason, the Israelites, they refuse, like, they just want to chase after any other God but Yahweh. And Solomon does the same thing, right? Yahweh is the God of Israel, yet the king of Israel refuses to obey him and serve him. That's wild, right? That's the first issue. The second thing is that Yahweh had appeared to him twice. What two instances are we talking about? What was the first time God appeared to Solomon?
When he made the temple, when he came in the clouds?
No.
What is that?
Whenever Solomon asked for wisdom.
When Solomon asked for wisdom, right? Remember? He came and visited Solomon in a dream and said, ask anything of me and I'll give it to you. That was the first time. When was the second time?
After he finished building the temple.
After he finished building the temple, right? Chapter 9. Right? So in chapter 3 and in chapter 9, God appeared to Solomon. Well, why is that an issue? Well, Solomon got more revelation from God than David ever did. Right? Do we have any moments in David's story where God explicitly shows up to David? No. Right? If anything, Solomon's more like an Abraham figure. Right? More of a Moses figure. Right? Where those people interact with God, David never did. Right? David was more like Joseph. Right? Joseph was this guy who was faithful to God despite never having any direct encounters with God. Right? That was David. Solomon, he's interacted with God twice. Right? The God of Israel, think about how much easier it should be to worship this God if he's shown up to you twice. Solomon knows where his wealth and wisdom came from. It came from Yahweh. Right? Yahweh literally interacted with him and said, hey, I'm going to give you wealth and wisdom and all that stuff. Right? If I were to get wealthy all of a sudden, I would have to figure out whether or not that came from God or whether it came from my own sinful desires. Solomon didn't have that problem. He knew exactly where everything came from because God told him. But then, here comes the third issue. At both of those occurrences, God gave him a warning. And he commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not walk after other gods. So, it's not only that this is the God of Israel, but this is the God of Israel who showed up to Solomon, and it's the God of Israel who showed up to Solomon and warned him not to do the very thing that he's currently doing. So each of those builds on one another. You see that? Yep. First off, him being the God of Israel should have been enough. Yep. Honestly, him being Yahweh should have been enough. Him being the God of Israel is another thing that should have been enough. Him appearing to Solomon is even more enough. And him explicitly telling Solomon, don't do this thing. That's more than enough. Solomon had no excuse. Yet he turned after other gods. That's why God is so angry. Right? This is whenever you read God saying, I'm slow to anger, and it says long of nose, right? This is what he means, right? He could have gotten angry about just one of these things, but he had given Solomon no excuse. Solomon had every reason to obey. And Solomon's literally at a point where God literally can't give him anything else, right? What else could God give Solomon to encourage obedience? He's already given him wisdom, wealth, prestige, power, divine revelations, warnings from God, the entire Torah, right? A faithful father. Solomon has everything. At this point, it is just human sinfulness that leads him away. That's why God's mad. So he said that he should not do this, but he did not keep what Yahweh had commanded. That's why God's angry. Verse 11. So Yahweh said to Solomon. Looks like God appears to him another time. Right? You'll notice that all this is happening in threes. Right? God appears twice, and on the third time, here's the judgment. Right? So Yahweh said to Solomon, because this has happened with you, you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, so I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant or slave. What does that sound like?
Is that chapter 14? 15?
I think it's 15. 1 Samuel, chapter 15. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I have indeed transgressed the command of Yahweh and your words, because I feared the people and I listened to their voice. Now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may worship Yahweh. But Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of Yahweh, and Yahweh has rejected you from being king over Israel. As Samuel turned to go, Saul seized the edge of his robe and it tore. So Samuel said to him, Yahweh has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today. and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. Also, the glory of Israel will not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. Sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
The kingdom has been torn from you. King Saul's kingdom was promised to his neighbor. Who is Solomon's kingdom promised to? His servant, his slave. Right? So it's even worse. But at the same time, it's better. Because as we're going to see, it's not going to stop there. Right? God's going to say, I'm taking the kingdom away from you, but he's going to say, I'm not going to take it away in the same way I took it from King Saul. Right? Because whenever he said that I'm taking the kingdom from Saul, what did he mean?
He'll give it to somebody better than you.
Yeah, but what did he mean by taking the kingdom away?
His sons won't be able to.
Yes, your dynasty ends here. Right? Whereas with Solomon, that's not what he means. And he can't mean that. Because he made a covenant to David, which Rocky mentioned earlier. Right? He made a covenant to David saying, your sons will be king forever. Right? And so he's promised that there will be a king on the throne unto eternity. Whether or not they are successively on the throne is up for debate. But he has a promise he has to keep with David. And so right here, and he's going to clarify this in verses 12 and 13. He's going to say, I've torn the kingdom from you, but I'm not going to destroy your dynasty. Right? And so whenever he says, I've taken the kingdom from you, he's saying, I'm going to give most of it away. Right? You're going to be reduced to basically nothing. Right? This is why later on, you have the prophets who will say, but a shoot will rise up from the stump of Jesse. Right? Because the imagery is, what is a stump?
What, like a tree that's been cut down?
A tree that's been cut down. Right? Who is Jesse?
The father of David.
The father of David. Right? So a shoot will rise from the stump of Jesse. Right? The imagery is that the kingdom that David built will be cut down. And David's own family will be cut down to basically nothing. But from that stump and that thing that looks dead will grow a little branch, a little shoot. And that shoot will reign over Israel forever. It's talking about Jesus. Right? But it's going back to this. Your kingdom will be taken away. It's going to be torn apart. So Yahweh said, because this has happened to you, you have not kept my commandments and statutes, but I have commanded you, I will take the kingdom from you and will give it to your slave. I want to look real quick. Just because this is one of my favorite things whenever Hebrew does this. I want to see what the word surely is there. Yes, okay. Whenever Hebrew is, like the way that Hebrew people can convey importance, or that they convey that something is really significant, they'll repeat words, right? Think about whenever Jesus is saying something super important, he says, Amen, amen, I say to you. Truly, truly, I say to you. And we do this as well, right? Hey, listen up, right? We'll repeat something to try to get people's attention. Well, the Bible does this a lot, right? So whenever God gives his commandment to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, he says, the way that we translate it is that he says, from any tree in the garden you may surely eat, but if you eat from this one particular tree, you will surely die. Well, in Hebrew, the phrase literally says, from any tree in the garden you may eat, but if you eat from this one particular tree, you will die. Right? And we translate it as surely eat, surely die, because that's how you speak in English. Right? But in Hebrew, they literally repeat the word twice. They do the same thing here as well. The word for tear is kara. Right? And what God says is, since you have not obeyed me, I will kara the kingdom from you. I will tear the kingdom from you. Right? It is going to be like, I'm not just tearing it, I am tearing it. Right? It is going to be torn, buddy. Right? I will surely tear. Like, there's basically what he's saying is there's no coming back. Right? Even if Solomon repented right there, this is the divine judgment of God. He says that this is going to happen. Right? The kingdom is going to be torn. Even if you repent, you cannot change the judgment I have just given you. I am tearing it. Right? Kara. I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. And sure enough, we're going to see that the person who gets the majority of the kingdom is going to be Solomon's literal servant or slave. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will kara it out of the hand of your son. What does he say there? And why is it so amazing?
cool that God sometimes will, like show mercy to people for the sake of someone else He really cares about. Kind of like with Abraham and Lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The whole reason Lot was saved from Sodom and Gomorrah was because of Abraham. And ironically, Lot's family are the descendants who led Solomon astray. The Moabites and the Ammonites. But yeah, so God does this. And I think this is really cool because once again, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, they're teaching us a theology of the heart. What was the first thing we learned about David before he even became king? Before he was introduced to the story, before we even knew David's name, what did we know about him? He was a man after God's own heart. And so the rest of Samuel and the rest of Kings are teaching us a theology of what it means to be a man or woman after God's own heart. And how many times, just in 1 Kings alone, have we seen God speak to Solomon and say that he's going to do something on behalf of David? That teaches us something about how God treats people who are wholly devoted to him. Right? Think about this. If you are wholly devoted to God, that might have implications on people in your family and your loved ones. It doesn't mean that they're going to be wholly devoted to God, but it might mean that God is more gracious to them on your behalf. If that isn't more motivation to be devoted to God, I don't know what is. Right? Like Solomon here, he deserves to have his kingdom stripped away. But because his father was faithful, God says, no, I'll let you die in peace. Right? Your father named you Shlomo, and you shall die in shalom. Right? Even though you're not shalom to me. Right? He says, you're going to die and it'll be fine. But because of what you've done, and right, notice this, right? David's faithfulness allowed Solomon to prosper. Solomon's unfaithfulness leads to his son's discipline. Right? And this is the importance of discipleship. Right? Yes. Our faithfulness doesn't just affect us, it affects the future generations. David was faithful, but he suffered during his life. Solomon reaped the benefits of David's faithfulness. Solomon was faithful for a time, but he was unfaithful at the end, and his son's going to reap the consequences of Solomon's unfaithfulness. It makes me think of the story of the paralytic who's just lowered through the roof, with Jesus, and Jesus marvels at the friend's faith. It says that he marveled at the faith of the friends, and he turns to the man and says, your sins are forgiven. It's one of the most perplexing stories because it's like, wait, he looked at the friend's faith and then he forgave the man. It's weird, right? But the idea is that there's something crazy going on there that only God knows, right? But God looks to the heart. And the heart of one faithful king, David was not perfect, but he was faithful, right? And his heart was wholly devoted to God. And all the stuff happening right here is happening decades after David. But God shows up to him and says, hey, remember David? He was wholly devoted to me. And so because of your dad's faithfulness, you are spared. I bet Solomon was feeling really grateful for his dad right then. Right? So that should teach us something. Right? Our devotion to God does not just affect our relationship with him. It might very well affect how God treats other people. Right? And you don't want to read too much into it because we're not going to always know exactly why God is treating people certain ways. Right? And so if everybody around you is just suffering, you don't want to think, oh man, this is all because I'm just being terrible to God. Right? And if everybody is prospering, you don't want to think, haha, it's because I'm faithful. No. Right here, God is explicitly explaining it to Solomon. Right? That's how we can know this. But it does teach us that God does work in this way. Right? And so that should motivate us to future faithfulness. Right? So I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Anybody know what Solomon's son's name is going to be?
Rehoboam.
Rehoboam. Yeah. Solomon, well, you all know him. He had good old Rehoboam. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of who?
David.
My servant David. And for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Do you remember why he chose Jerusalem?
Because of David.
Because David chose Jerusalem. Right? It all goes back to David. Right? This is what I'm saying. And if you think this is the last time it's going to mention it, it's not. David is going to be the standard for the rest of 1st and 2nd Kings. Right? God is always going to look back at David and be like, remember that dude? That dude was a man after my own heart. And everything he does going forward is going to hinge off of David's faithfulness. That's the type of person we want to be, right? We want to be the type of person where for hundreds of years from now, like, it doesn't mean that our names are going to be written down in the history books, right? But God's Hall of Fame is way more important than man's Hall of Fame, right? We want to be the type of people who are so faithful that hundreds of years from now, God is looking at the world around us and saying, you know what? I will spare these people because of my servant Maverick. He was a faithful man. And so these people deserve a lot worse than they're getting, but I'm going to preserve them because of how faithful Maverick was. Or Ben. Or George. Right? That's what we want to be. Right? We don't want God to look and say, you didn't measure up to Rocky's standard. Right? Or we don't want God to look at Rocky and say, you didn't live up to your dad's standard. We don't want that, right? And we don't want our kids to do that, right? We want to produce disciples, right? And we should hope that our kids surpass us in faithfulness, right? We don't want to be faithful so that we can be known for our faithfulness. If anything, we want to be known for the faith that we produce in others. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. Right? So, for the sake of David and Jerusalem, right? His king and the head of his kingdom. Right? Jerusalem, the city of peace. He says, for those sakes, I will not destroy the kingdom. Ironically, though, do you know what tribe Jerusalem is located in? Like, the tribal allotment.
I'm going to guess Judah.
It is not in the tribe of Judah.
Is it Benjamin?
Benjamin. Yes. I mainly highlight this because this is going to be really significant. Because he says, I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David. What tribe is he probably referring to? What tribe is he going to give to Rehoboam on behalf of David?
Benjamin?
No, not Benjamin. Judah, right? Because that's the tribe that David's from, right? He's going to give Judah to Rehoboam because that's going to be the people who side with Rehoboam, right? It's going to be the descent, families are going to pick sides, right? So they're going to receive Judah, but he says that I'm going to do this for the sake of Jerusalem, which is in Benjamin. And so who do you think is going to also go with Judah? Benjamin, right? And Benjamin's a really small tribe. And the main reason I highlight this is because what we're going to see is that once the divided kingdom hits, there's going to be a split, right? There's going to be 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the south, right? It's going to be Judah and Benjamin down here, and then it's going to be the other 10 tribes up north, right? And that's because Jerusalem's in Benjamin, and then you have, so that they go with Judah, right? And so it's for the sake of David from the tribe of Judah and Jerusalem in the tribe of Benjamin, right? Also, I just thought of this connection. If you go back to Genesis, really cool connection here. Whenever, the whole reason why Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers is whenever his brother Judah is kneeling before him, offering himself as a substitutionary atonement in place of Benjamin, right? And so you have this connection between Judah and Benjamin way back in Genesis, right? Where Judah's like, no, take me instead of Benjamin. And then now these people are going to be sealed together going forward. It's just kind of cool. Okay, so there's that. And really what happens here is that these verses set in motion the events of the rest of 1st and 2nd Kings. Right? So right here, there's our outline. Right? He says, I'm going to tear the kingdom apart, but you're not going to be destroyed. Well, there you go. That's going to be it. Right? So the kingdom will be torn away from Solomon. And what we can expect in the chapters to come is that the kingdom's going to get really, really small, but it will not be decimated. Right? Because God made a promise to David. For the sake of David, for the sake of Jerusalem. Right? So he's got to fulfill his covenant to David, but he also has to stick with Jerusalem. Why does he have to stick with Jerusalem?
That's what David chose.
It's what David chose, but why did David need to choose a place?
For the palace.
It's where God's name dwells.
Well, it's where God's name dwells, right? This goes back to the Torah, right? God said, I'm going to pick a place where my name will dwell forever, right? Go back to, I think it's Deuteronomy chapter 11, right? God said, I'm going to pick a place where my name's going to dwell forever. David picked Jerusalem, and God said, okay, fine, I picked Jerusalem, right? And so even though the Mosaic covenant is a temporary thing, God's name is going to dwell in Jerusalem forever. And whenever you read in the New Testament, about the new heavens and the new earth, where is it that Jesus reigns from? Jerusalem, right? And so this city that David picked has eternal implications. And so he says, well, I have a covenant I need to keep to David, and that covenant is tied to Jerusalem. And so those are two eternal things that God says I'm going to preserve, right? And so that kind of shapes things going forward as well. And that's why anytime Israel or Judah is demolished, Jerusalem's going to be the last city to go, right? Because Jerusalem is the center of the whole nation, right? Like that is the most important city, right? And so whenever we talk about the destruction of Israel, it always goes back to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC, by the Romans in AD 70. Jerusalem is always the thing around which the entire world revolves, because that's the place where God's name came to dwell. All right, let's move on and let's go into the next part.
Then Yahweh raised up an adversary to Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the seed of the king in Edom. Now it happened that when David was in Edom, and Joab the commander of the army had gone up to bury the slain, and had struck down every male in Edom, for Joab and all Israel stayed there 6 months, until he had cut off every male in Edom, that Hadad fled to Egypt, and he and certain Edomites of his father's servants with him, while Hadad was a young boy. Then they arose from Midian and came to Paran, and they took men with them from Paran and came to Egypt, to Pharaoh king of Egypt. And he gave him a house, and assigned him food, and gave him land. And Hadad found great favor in the sight of Pharaoh. So he gave him as a wife the sister of his own wife, the sister of Taphanes the queen. And the sister of Taphanes bore his son, Genubath. And Taphanes weaned him in Pharaoh's house, and Genubath was in Pharaoh's house among the sons of Pharaoh.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So what God's going to do is he is going to raise up 3 devils to go against Solomon.
Oh,
Why do I say devil?
because he's like an adversary to him?
Well, yeah. What is the word, like right there in verse 14? Yahweh raised up an adversary. What is the word for adversary in Hebrew?
Satan.
Satan, right? It's where we get the word Satan from,
Ugh.
right? And so it literally says Yahweh raised up a Satan to Solomon. Like whenever we say Satan, we're talking about the adversary, right? So there are many Satans, but there is one capital S, Satan, right? The adversary of all adversaries, right? Just like there are many gods, little g, but there is one God, big G, right? So Yahweh raised up an adversary to Solomon. Hold up. Who raised up the Satan?
Yahweh.
Yahweh. Hold up. So you're saying that God can raise up evil people to oppose his chosen people? What? All right, well, here's just some theology that we got to wrap our minds around. So here we have got a person being raised up by God to go against Solomon. So God is the one employing him to do this. However, does Hadad the Edomite, from his perspective, does he know that that's what God's doing?
No.
No. So even though God is the one employing him to do this, is Hadad guilty for what he's doing?
Yes.
Yes. Right? He doesn't know that God is the one causing him to do this. As we see here in verses 15 through 20, Hadad has his own reasons for wanting to oppose Solomon. Right? He's out for vengeance. Right? Apparently from his youth, he was waiting for the day whenever he can attack. So he has been plotting vengeance his entire life. But at the same time, we see that God is the one orchestrating things behind the scenes. Right? That doesn't take away Hadad's culpability in evil. Right? You know, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who slight you. Well, Hadad's going to oppose Solomon, and therefore Hadad is a villain in the story. But that doesn't take away God's sovereignty. God is still in control. I mainly raise this because I want you to notice this is the theology of the Bible. God is in control of things, yet man is still responsible for his actions. Right? Later on, we're going to see another man who does this same sort of thing, where there's this Son of God who comes to earth, and an adversary rises up to betray him so that he can be crucified. Right? What is this adversary's name?
Judas.
Judas Iscariot. And it even says that he is possessed by the devil himself. Right? Satan comes into him. But God promised ahead of time that this was going to happen. And so people will debate and they'll say, oh, was Judas really guilty of what he did? Absolutely. Right? This is the theology of the Bible. right? God is in charge of things, and he can work things for good, but that doesn't take away from the evil that men are doing, right? And so Hadad is a bad guy, but the cool thing is that God can take even bad guys and work it for his good purposes, right? And so Hadad is going to do this bad thing either way. God is using what Hadad is planning for evil to discipline Solomon, right? And this is just a theology that you got to get comfortable with the Bible. It's a little bit complicated and convoluted, but that's the wisdom of God. So Yahweh raised up an adversary to Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the seed of the king of Edom. All right, first off, Edom. Who is that descended from?
Esau.
Esau, right? So he is kind of a brother to Israel, right? Edomites, those are amongst the people that Solomon married, right? So these are people they were supposed to be at peace with. If you're looking at a map of Israel, where is Edom? North, south, east, west?
Is it east?
Kind of. It is a little bit to the east, but yeah, if you go to the west of Israel, you're in the Mediterranean Sea. Mm. So this is not Atlantis we're talking about.
It's a little south, right?
It's southeast, right? It's more to the south, right? This is the region that you'd know as like Petra nowadays, right? The Red Rock Canyons and stuff down south. Edom literally means red. So there's this guy named Hadad. He is an Edomite, and it says he was of the seed of the king in Edom, right? So who is he?
Son.
He's a descendant of the king of Edom, right? So he's royalty. Now it happened that when David was in Edom, and Joab, the commander of the army, had gone up to bury the slain, and had struck down every male in Edom, for Joab and all Israel stayed there 6 months, until he had cut off every male in Edom, right? So David was on a military campaign, right? And this is decades earlier, right? So this is whenever David was king, and he went through the land, and apparently he conquered Edom, because this is what David did, right? He was a conquering king. And they kill every male in Edom. Why would they kill every male in Edom?
So no one can raise up and try to fight him.
Well, yeah, and also that's what God commanded them to do in the law, right? So they were called to go do this, right? And they wiped out the Edomites. They killed every male. And Joab and Israel, they stayed there 6 months until they cut off everyone. So they thought that they finished the job, right? Well, during that time period, Hadad had fled down to Egypt. He and certain Edomites of his father's servants with him while he was a young boy. So during this whole time, they thought that they had finished the job. But Hadad had escaped, right? And he went down to Egypt, and he stayed in Egypt for a while along with some other servants. Ooh, intriguing. All right. Then they arose from Midian and came to Paran, right? Interesting. So they go down to Egypt, and then they arise in Midian. Whenever you think of Midian, whose story do you think of?
Gideon?
Gideon did fight the Midianites. I'm thinking more of Moses, right? Moses left Egypt and came to Midian, right?
Oh, for his wife, right?
Yes, yeah. And that's where he encountered the burning bush and Mount Sinai and everything, right? They arose from Midian and came to Paran, and they took men with them from Paran and came to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, right? So apparently he grows up, he goes back down to Egypt, and he brings his men with him. He goes to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he gave him a house and assigned him food and gave him land. So how does Pharaoh treat Hadad when they get down there?
Like a son.
Like a son, right? He treats him very well, right? He welcomes them in. He says, hey, here's a house. Here's some food for you. Here's some land. He treats him like royalty. And Hadad found great favor in the sight of Pharaoh. So he gave him as a wife the sister of his own wife. So his sister-in-law, right? So Pharaoh's sister-in-law marries Hadad, right? So this is a alliance, right? The sister of Taphnes, the queen. And the sister of Taphnes bore his son Genubath. And Taphnes weaned him in Pharaoh's house, and Genubath was in Pharaoh's house among the sons of Pharaoh. Okay, why is it telling us all this backstory?
Because it's important.
Probably because it's important, right? If anything, it's just telling you the political reasons why Hadad might want to be an adversary to Solomon. Why do you think Hadad would want to oppose Solomon?
Kill his dad.
Well, yeah. Well, because Solomon's dad murdered their entire nation, right? And this is usually why the Torah says wipe out everybody. Because if you don't wipe out everybody, one of the kids might grow up to oppose you. It just so happened that Hadad escaped, right? And so Hadad is a living example of why you wipe out everybody. I know a lot of people, they read the Old Testament and they get really uncomfortable whenever God says wipe out all of them. This is why you do it. Because if one of the kids gets away and he raises up, well, guess what? He might want to come wipe you back out, right? And so Hadad's been biding his time. But one thing I want to highlight here is that, that commentary I've been reading? The guy highlights, so what's going to happen in this story, in this chapter, is that the author is going to list out 3 adversaries raised up against Solomon. And each of these adversaries is going to be given a backstory. And each of those backstories is actually going to have a parallel with Israel's own backstory, right? So I'm going to read through these, right? So we've already broken down exactly what happens here with Hadad, but let me read you what this guy says. First off, as a boy, Hadad is carried to Egypt because Edom is occupied by David and Joab, right? Well, earlier, if you go back to the book of Genesis, Jacob takes his clan to Egypt because of famine, right? So Hadad goes down to Egypt. So Hadad leaves the land of the Canaan region to go down to Egypt because people are occupying his land. Abraham leaves the Canaan region to go down to Egypt because of famine. Secondly, while in Egypt, Hadad is treated kindly by Pharaoh, given a house, bread, and land. Similarly, back in Genesis, Jacob's family is treated well by Pharaoh and given the fruitful land of Goshen. That's how Genesis ends. Thirdly, Hadad marries into the Egyptian royal family, just as earlier Joseph receives Pharaoh's favor and marries the daughter of an Egyptian priest. Right? So when you go back to the book of Genesis, Joseph is in the land, once again, remember, because of the hardship brought upon him, and he receives favor from Pharaoh, he's elevated to second in command, and he marries an Egyptian princess. Fourthly, Hadad's son is among the sons of Pharaoh, born to the sister of Tophnes, the queen of Egypt. Here we seem to have an echo of the story of Moses, who is raised in Pharaoh's house. Right? So if you read into the book of Exodus, Moses also is raised up in Pharaoh's house. Remember how I mentioned that Midian's associated with Moses? Right? And so you have this parallel. Fifthly, when David dies, and this is what we're going to see in just a second, when David dies, Hadad sought to return to the land using Exodus language to express his desire. He's going to use the phrase, send me out. We're going to see this in the next few verses. He's going to say, send me out. Similarly, Israel is going to escape Egypt, or if you go, Israel did escape Egypt, in the Exodus story and conquers the land of Canaan and rules over it. Right? And so, in many ways, Hadad, the brother of Israel, right? Edom is the brother of Israel, right? Hadad is following in the footsteps of Israel's story, and now he's coming back to conquer the land, right? That's what we're going to see in the next few verses. So, if Hadad is the new Israel, who does that make Solomon? Who is he now in place of? No. So, whenever Israel left Egypt, who did they go conquer? The Canaanites, right? So Solomon has become a Canaanite, which makes sense because he's married Canaanites, right? So Solomon has attached himself and clung to foreign women, and now he has become like them. He's abandoned the God of Israel and embraced the God of the Canaanites, and so Solomon has become a Canaanite who needs to be driven from the land, right? So we get to these next few verses. Let's just read verses 21 and 22 for now.
Okay. But Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his fathers, and that Joab the commander of the army had died. So Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Send me away, that I may go to my own country." Then Pharaoh said to him, "But what have you lacked with me, that behold, you are seeking to go to your own country?" And he answered, "Nothing. Nevertheless, you must surely let me go."
Thank you. So now you should hopefully see the parallels there, right? But Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his fathers and that Joab, the commander of the army, had died. Do you remember what it was like whenever... So Moses, remember, he fled to Midian, right? And then whenever he returned to Egypt, we had read that the Pharaoh had died, right? So after the Pharaoh had died, God appeared to Moses at the burning bush and sent him back down, right? And whenever Moses went back down, what did he say? Let my people go. Send us out. Same story here. Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his fathers and that Joab, the commander of the army, had died. So it seems like Hadad, so he's grown, right? Decades have passed. Hadad has now grown into a man, and he knew that God was with David. And he knew that he could not overcome David, right? Especially not with Joab, because what's our rule about Joab?
You don't mess with Joab.
You don't mess with Joab, right? I'm glad y'all still remember that. Good. Always remember it. Don't mess with Joab. So Hadad knew he couldn't defeat David or Joab, but he might be able to take on Solomon. And so he has risen to prominence, and so he says to Pharaoh, send me away that I may go to my own country. When he's referencing his own country, what's he talking about? Where's he from?
Egypt.
He's not from Egypt. He's from Edom, right? He's from Edom, right? And so he wants to go back to Edom. The issue is, under Solomon, Edom is one of their vassal states, right? And he has an alliance with them, right? But Hadad is not coming back to embrace any alliance, right? He's here for war. So he says, send me away that I may go to my own country. Then Pharaoh said to him, but what have you lacked with me? That behold, you are seeking to go to your own country. So Pharaoh's like, what? Has what I provided you, is that not good enough? And Hadad says, nothing. Nevertheless, you must surely let me go. He says, no, this isn't against you. It's a thing I need to take care of. Right? He's like, Pharaoh, you have been a gracious host. You have been so kind to me. But there's something I need to do. What does he have in mind?
Go take out Solomon.
Vengeance.
Yeah.
Right? This is honestly, Hadad would be the protagonist in like most stories nowadays. Right? I mean, it's a pretty cool story. Right? This guy who had, like, if you view it from his perspective and you don't know the broader story of the people of Israel, Hadad is the main story, like main character in most stories, right? You've got this conquering tyrant king named David who comes in and he wipes out your entire people. But as a young child, you escape into a foreign land and you're raised up by a foreign king until you have this army to go with you. And then the tyrant king dies, leaving behind a weak son in his stead. And you realize that now it's time to go retrieve your homeland. Right? I mean, it's a pretty cool story. I mean, like I said, it's literally the story of the people of Israel, right? Like, this is their story, right? It is them going down into Egypt and the exodus out of Egypt and then going to conquer the promised land, right? Like, that is Hadad's story. And it's a pretty cool story. But it's fueled by vengeance, right? This is the Count of Monte Cristo going out to take vengeance on the people who have wronged him. But Hadad is being fueled by vengeance, which is not a good thing. But at the same time, God's the one who raised him up, right? God allowed this to happen, right? Even before Solomon ever committed this sin, it was God who allowed Hadad to escape David's sword. It was God who allowed Hadad to go down to Egypt and prosper there and to raise up an army. Solomon hadn't even become king yet, but God knew what Solomon would do. And so he had been raising up this enemy to oppose Solomon this entire time. Does not justify what Hadad's going to do, but it shows you the sovereignty of God, right? How God knew this was going to happen, right? He's allowing it. And he's even taking an active role in it. But that's not the only adversary that God raises up. Let's look at verse 23. You read the rest of that song. I called you Solomon. Sean?
And God raised up another adversary to him, Rezon the son of Eliada, who had fled from his lord Hadadezer, king of Zobah. And he gathered men to himself, and became commander of a marauding band, after David killed some of them. And they went to Damascus and stayed there, and reigned in Damascus. So he was an adversary to Israel all the days of Solomon, along with the evil that Hadad did. And he abhorred Israel, and reigned over Aram.
All right, perfect. So this guy is from Aram, right, or Aram. What region is Aram? It mentions Damascus there.
North.
It is north, correct?
It's like Syria.
Syria, yes. And so Syria is directly north. Edom is the south. So, wow, this is really not looking good for Solomon, right? He's got enemies from the south and from the north, and guess where the next one's going to come from? You would think it's going to come from the east, but it's actually worse than that.
North?
The west.
No, it's not from the west either. It's going to come from their midst,
Oh.
right? Yeah, and that's going to be the big enemy. right? Rezin. This is the only part we're reading about, like his backstory, right? He's got a very short one. And God raised up another Satan to Solomon, Rezin the son of Eliada, who had fled from his lord Hadadezer, king of Zobah. And he gathered men to himself and became commander of a marauding band after David killed some of them. Whoa, it goes back to David again. Wow, it's almost like God, like it's highlighting God's sovereignty, right? The fact that he's being faithful to David, but even back in David's time, he anticipated Solomon's failure. And so throughout all of this, God was raising up this adversary against Solomon before Solomon was even on the throne, because he knew what Solomon would do. So he gathered men to himself and became commander of a marauding band after David killed some of them. And they went to Damascus and stayed there and reigned in Damascus, right? So Rezin comes to reign in Damascus, having escaped, once again, David. So he was a Satan to Israel all the days of Solomon, along with the evil that Hadad did. Whoa, how can he say that what Hadad did was evil? Didn't God raise him up? You see what I'm saying about the theology of the Bible? Right? Man is responsible for what he does, and it is still evil, even though God is using it to accomplish good. Right? And you have to be fine with those two things. Right? God can use evil to accomplish good. That's biblical theology. Might not make sense to us. Didn't make sense to a lot of people. Go read the book of Habakkuk. That is he's confused about it. And you know how God responds to Habakkuk when he asks how that works out? He says, the righteous will live by faith. He just says, trust me, Habakkuk. I got this. So he was a Satan to Israel all the days of Solomon, along with the evil that Hadad did. And he abhorred Israel and reigned over Aram. Ironically, when you go to the last chapter, or maybe it was chapter 9, I don't remember which one. Do you remember who Solomon gave chariots to?
Oh.
Is the Hittites and the Arameans?
Yeah, it was the Hittites and the Arameans. Huh. Well, Solomon just gave chariots to people who hated him. Good job, Solomon. I guess the peace went through his head, and he didn't realize that he probably should not be funding these people because there might be somebody in there who hates him.
I guess he just wasn't as wise as he thought he was.
Yeah. Well, that's the crazy thing about the whole story, right? Is that Solomon makes his biggest blunders when he's at the height of his wisdom. Right? His wisdom gives him all this prosperity, yet from that prosperity he makes the stupidest mistakes. Let's look at the parallels we have between Rezin and the story of Israel. Rezin flees from his lord Hadadezer, just as David is threatened and flees from his master Saul. Right? So Hadadezer led to Rezin fleeing away, just like Saul led to David fleeing away. Secondly, Rezin gathers a band to himself and becomes the leader of a kind of guerrilla force, right? It says a marauding band. David also fled into the wilderness and began to gather the disaffected to himself, forming them into a Israel in exile, right? Just like, because, Saul was an oppressive force, and so the disenfranchised and stuff fled to David. Well, that same thing's happening with Rezin. So Rezin kind of is like a little David. Thirdly, Rezin moves to Damascus to become king over Syria, just as David moves from the wilderness into the land to take the throne at Hebron and eventually at Jerusalem. So it's following the same path, right? So if Hadad was like a picture of Israel, Rezin is like a picture of David. Okay, and now Rezin is opposed to Solomon, which puts Solomon in what place? Saul, right? Solomon is the new Saul, who gets his kingdom torn away by another, right? So, not looking good for Solomon, huh? He's the Canaanite of the story. He is the Saul of the story. I guess let's keep reading to see how he relates to the last guy. Let's talk about good old Jeroboam. Good luck.
Now Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zeradah, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow, also raised his hand against the king. Now this was the reason why he raised his hand against the king. Solomon built the Milo and closed up the breach of the city of his father David. Now the man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor, And Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, and appointed him over all the load bearers of the house of Joseph. Now it happened at that time that Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, and that the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him on the road. Now he had covered himself with a new cloak, and both of them were alone in the field. Then Ahijah took hold of the new cloak which was on him, and tore it into 12 pieces. And he said to Jeroboam, Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says Yahweh the God of Israel, Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes. But he will have 1 tribe, for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, because they have forsaken me, and have worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the sons of Ammon. And they have not walked in my ways to do what is right in my sight, and to keep my statutes and my judgments, as his father David did. Nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him ruler all the days of his life, for the sake of my servant David whom I chose, who kept my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom from his son's hand and give it to you, the 10 tribes.
The 10 tribes. Yes?
Go on.
Okay. Fun little wordplay here again. There's a lot of wordplay around the name Solomon in this whole story. The word cloak, right? Now it says Ahijah took hold of the new cloak which was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. First off, what story does that once again call back to?
Judges.
Judges, right? So you have things being cut in 12 pieces, right? So you have the concubine cut in 12 pieces. And then when you get into 1 Samuel, you have King Saul cutting the ox into 12 pieces. But here you have a cloak being torn. What does that also call back to?
Yeah.
The same story I referenced
Actually,
earlier.
The cave.
David and Saul.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
okay, I forgot about that. Yeah, David cutting the cloak off Saul. I was talking about the story with Samuel, right? The one I read earlier, right? Where Samuel literally tore Saul's robe and says, I have torn the kingdom from you.
Mm-hmm.
Because here we have a prophet showing up to a man and saying, I have torn the kingdom from somebody, right? So it calls back to it, right? There's all these references here. But the word for cloak in Hebrew is shalmah, right? So now we've got Shlomo, Solomon. We've got shalom, to tear. We've got shalmah, which is cloak. And we've got shalom, which is peace. And then there was another one, wasn't there? I don't remember what it was. But there's all these words that are word plays. Like if you look at them in Hebrew, it's like the same letters just being mixed up or just like an extra letter being put in there. Like the word for cloak here is literally, it's spelt the exact same as Solomon, except 2 letters were reversed, right? It's just fun, right? Because he's saying, I am taking Solomon and I'm giving it to you. Like, that's what's communicating, right? So, okay. So, by and large, what is the main thing that we see happening in this? Summarize it for me.
A prophet tells one of Solomon's servants that he's gonna have 10 tribes.
Yeah. This dude just barely walking by one day, and then a prophet shows up. That's pretty wild. Like, we haven't really seen prophets, like, showing up. Like, this is the first time, like, us really seeing just a prophet randomly show up, right? I mean, we've had named prophets before, right? We don't even learn the it's Ahijah, right? But this is one of the first times we see, like, a prophet just kind of show up out of nowhere, right? We've had Samuel show up, but we knew Samuel's backstory, right? And we knew that Samuel had, like, you know, a school of prophets and stuff like that. And then we've seen prophets like Nathan and people like that. But this dude just randomly shows up out of nowhere, right? And this is going to become a recurring thing throughout the rest of Kings, right? There's going to be more prophets being showing up, which also makes sense for the rest of the Old Testament, right? Because God is going to start sending more prophets. Like, as the people fall to sin, God is going to send more prophets to get onto them, right? So, let's read it. Now, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zeredah, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruah, a widow, also raised his hand against the king. The third Satan, right? The third adversary. Remember how I mentioned that there's going to be things that come in threes in this story? So first off, who did God say that he was going to give Solomon's kingdom to? Just a few verses ago. Remember, he had said, I've torn the kingdom away from you and I'm going to give it to your servant.
Yes.
He was speaking literally, right? So one adversary came from the south, one adversary came from the north, and one adversary came from within Solomon's own palace, right? A servant of Solomon is going to rebel against him. And all of these are being raised up by God, right? God is literally going to send a prophet to tell Jeroboam this is going to happen. What tribe is Jeroboam from?
Ephraim?
Ephraim, yes. Ephraim is a descendant of who? Because if you remember, Ephraim and Manasseh, they weren't sons of Jacob. They were sons of?
No.
Nope.
Joseph?
Joseph, right? Remember, because of all the stuff that Joseph went through in the book of Genesis, and because Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, remember, Jacob gave him 2 tribes, right? And so there is no tribe of Joseph. Instead, Joseph had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and those became the 2 tribes, right? So there's technically 13 tribes of Israel, but the Levites don't receive a tribal allotment because they were the priests, right? And so that's how we get 12 tribes, right? So Ephraim is one of the sons of Joseph, and if you remember, there's this whole story wherever Joseph brings his 2 sons before Jacob. It's actually whenever Jacob adopts Ephraim and Manasseh as his own, and Joseph is seeking a blessing for Ephraim and Manasseh. And of the 2, do you remember which one was older? It was Manasseh, right? And so Joseph wanted Manasseh to receive the greater blessing. And so he put Manasseh on the side where Jacob would put his right hand. But in the story, Jacob reaches out his hands and he crosses his arms and places his right hand on the younger son's head, right? On Ephraim. And Joseph gets mad about this. He's like, Dad, no. What are you doing? You're being weird. And Jacob says, no. God is going to bless Ephraim over Manasseh. And sure enough, whenever you look through Israel's history, Ephraim is the larger and more prosperous son. Jeroboam is going to eventually lead this rebellion where the kingdom is going to split in 2, right? You're going to have the southern kingdom, which is Judah and Benjamin, and they're going to go by Judah because Judah is the bigger tribe. And then the northern kingdom is going to be just called Israel, right? And it's the other 10 tribes. But whenever you read throughout the rest of the Old Testament, they won't only call the northern kingdom Israel. They will also call it Ephraim, right? Because of these tribes, Ephraim is going to be the most prominent, and it's also where Jeroboam is from. So whenever you're reading through the rest of the Old Testament, and God is specifically getting onto Ephraim, he's probably speaking of the whole 10 tribes of Israel, right? I just wanted you to keep in mind that, that's why that's significant. All right. So, was somebody going to say something? Okay. Now, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, the Ephraimite of Zerudah, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruah, a widow, also raised his hand against the king. He raises up as another adversary. Now, this was the reason why he raised his hand against the king. It's like the author's like, I bet you're wondering how we got here. Let me tell you. Flashback time. Solomon built the Millo and closed up the breach of the city of his father David. We've talked about the Millo before. Remember, this is the fortified wall we talked about outside of David's palace. It seems like the Jebusites had begun building this Millo before David ever conquered the city. David added to it, and Solomon apparently, he fortified it even more, right? And it says that he closed up the breach of the city of his father David. So maybe there was one place that David hadn't fully fortified well. Solomon finished that, right? And I talked about this, if you go to Israel to this day, to the archaeological site, you can still see the Millo. It's really cool. And so Solomon built that up. We've talked about Solomon the architect, right? He's really into architectural stuff. Now the man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor. Wow, we've heard that term quite a few times, especially back in the book of Judges, right? But also to describe David, right? He's a mighty man of valor. And Solomon saw that the young man was industrious and appointed him over all the load bearers of the house of Joseph. Okay, so why would he appoint him over the load bearers of the house of Joseph? Why Joseph in particular? Given what I just told y'all. Well, yeah, because Ephraim is the son of Joseph, right? And so basically it's saying that he put him over his whole family. Right? All the load bearers who were from the same tribe, he put him over them, right? And so Solomon recognizes that Jeroboam is apparently a, pretty worthwhile dude. He's a mighty man of valor. He is a good warrior. He's an able-bodied man, and he appoints him. Yes?
Keep going.
No, what were you going to say?
In this story, Solomon's looking like another Saul.
He's looking like Saul again, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yes. So he appoints him over all the load bearers of the house of Joseph in order to help build this Milo thing. Now it happened at that time that Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, and that the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him on the road. Okay, so Jeroboam goes out one day, and some prophet just randomly comes up to him. Now he had covered himself with a new cloak, and both of them were alone in the field. Sounds like a random detail that you would only mention if it was in some way significant to the story. Well, sure enough, it is, right? So the idea is that nobody else was here except for Jeroboam and him, right? These are the only two guys who knew about this thing, right? But going forward, Jeroboam knows this secret that nobody else knows. That he's one day going to be king. Who does that sound like? David, right? It's kind of like Samuel talking to David, saying, hey, God has torn away the kingdom from Saul, and he's going to give it to you. It's almost like there's a parallel. So he had covered himself with a new cloak, and both of them were alone in the field. Also, if you remember, Samuel was always associated with a cloak as well, right? His mother gave him a cloak every year whenever he was a kid. Later on, Saul tears the cloak, and that's what leads Samuel to say, yo, dude, God's torn the kingdom from you. And then whenever the witch of Endor conjures up Saul, remember the way that Saul is able to identify Samuel is that he recognizes the cloak, right? And so Jeroboam is wearing this new cloak, right? And Ahijah took hold of the new cloak, which was on him, and tore it into 12 pieces. He's like, yo, dude, give me that cloak. And he rips it up into 12 pieces. I imagine Jeroboam was probably pretty upset until he heard why the cloak was torn into 12 pieces, right? Oh, believe me, you're going to like what I give you instead, right? Why tear it into 12 pieces?
The 12 tribes.
12 tribes, right? And he said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces. But all 12 are mine. Take for yourself 10, right? This is what prophets are going to do a lot, right? They're going to have, not case studies, it's almost like dioramas. Like they're going to, what is it, like physical representations of the message. What is the word I'm looking for?
Like a...
Not like a replica, but...
Yeah, not a replica. Like there's a word for it.
I agree.
Yeah.
But it's just a visual demonstration is what they're doing, right? They're going to have a visual demonstration of their prophecy, right? He could easily, honestly, he could have just walked up and said, hey, dude, God's going to give you 10 tribes. But he doesn't do that, right? He gives a physical representation, and usually this is because it sticks in your mind more, right? If he just said it, it's like, okay, whatever. But if you picture this, you're like, oh, like that imagery is going to stick with you, right? He removed the cloak from him, metaphorically, kind of like how God removed the kingdom from Solomon. And now instead of the kingdom being one unified kingdom, like the cloak was, is being divided into its 12 tribes. And he says, all right, Jeroboam, take 10 of them. Right? Those 10 tribes are going to be yours. Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes. But he will have one tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel. Hold up. But that's only 11 tribes. Where's the 12th tribe? And that whole thing? So 10 tribes go to Jeroboam, 1 goes to Solomon for the sake of David. Where's the 12th tribe? We already talked about this earlier.
Ephraim?
No, not Ephraim. Ephraim is with Jeroboam.
It's Benjamin.
Benjamin, right? It's where Jerusalem's at, right? So he's saying one tribe is going to be for Solomon, but also for the sake of Jerusalem, Benjamin's going to end up going with Judah anyways, right? So take yourself 10 pieces, for thus says Yahweh, God of Israel, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes, but he will have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel. So he's going to give Judah to Solomon, but he's also going to give Jerusalem to Solomon because he chose that place out of all the tribes of Israel, right? And so he's kind of pointing out that Solomon is still going to be the true king, right? The places that he chose and the places that God identifies himself with, those are going with Solomon, right? He says, I have chosen David and I have chosen Jerusalem. So he says, I'm sorry, Jeroboam, you don't get that stuff, right? You're going to start your own new thing, and that is not the place that I chose to dwell at. So you're seceding from the nation, but the main nation's still going to be below you, right? This is punishment for what they've done, and you're getting a great thing, but I'm still going to be down there, right? Does that make sense? I'll tear the kingdom out of the hand. He will have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, because they have forsaken me and have worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the sons of Ammon. And they have not walked in my ways to do what is right in my sight and to keep my statutes and my judgments as his father David did. Keeps going back to David, right? David walked in all of his ways. Why? Well, because David didn't look left or right. Whenever it says walk in my ways, it's not saying perfection. It's saying there is the way of Yahweh. And David guarded it and protected it, as was the charge due. Like, that's why God chose Abraham, right? To guard and protect and keep the way of Yahweh, right? This is the language that Jesus is going to allude to when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? The whole story of the Bible is about protecting the way, right? You got to guard the way and keep it straight. Solomon, he didn't. Right? He decided to make forks in the road and decided to go all these different directions. He's like, oh yeah, there is that one way to Yahweh. God says, no. You've got to, Israel's job is to make all other ways off limits. One way. Nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose, who kept my commandments and my statutes. Keeps coming back to David. He also just, once again, highlights his grace, right? I'm not going to take it all from his hand, right? You're going to get 10 tribes. I'm going to leave 2 tribes with him. And I'm going to let him finish out his reign, right? We don't know when all this stuff's happening, right? We just know that this is happening near the end of Solomon's life, probably. But it could be, for all we know, it could be decades before the end of Solomon's life. We just know it's after Solomon's temple's been completed, but that's still pretty early on in the reign. Right, so it's somewhere in between there. But God says, I'm going to let him finish his run. Right? After he dies, though, that's whenever it's your turn to take over stuff. And so until then, Jeroboam's just going to be abiding his time. But I will take the kingdom from his son's hand and give it to you, the 10 tribes. And sure enough, whenever Solomon dies, that very year, Jeroboam's going to come in and take the tribes. All right, anything y'all want to add to that before we move on? All right, let's take it away. This is the end of the chapter. Just read through verse 40 for me.
Okay. But to his son I will give one tribe, that my servant David may have a lamp always before me in Jerusalem, the city where I have chosen for myself to put my name. And I will take you, and you shall reign over whatever your soul desires, and you shall be king over Israel. Then it will be that if you listen to all that I command you, and walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight to keep my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you, and build you an enduring house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. Thus I will afflict the seed of David for this, but not always. Solomon sought therefore to put Jeroboam to death. But Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt to Shishak, king of Egypt, and he was in Egypt until the death of Solomon.
Very good. All right. So hopefully y'all once again see the parallels with the story of Israel. We'll talk about that again in a second. So what happens here?
Jeroboam's kind of getting the privilege of David, the 10 tribes.
Yeah.
As long as you follow God's commandments, you'll keep it.
Yeah, we get eerily close to a Jeroboamian covenant right here. Jeroboamic. Not quite though, but it gets close, right? Mm-hmm. Ironically, do you know the reason why we don't hear about the house of Jeroboam anymore?
Because he does not.
Yeah, he doesn't follow the ways of Yahweh, right? Like God's whole thing to David was, if you follow me, then I will make you an enduring house, and David did it. Whereas Jeroboam's not going to do it. So, yeah, and so it's like, all right, so nope, never mind, Jeroboam, you tried. So one thing we're going to see with the southern kingdom is that for the southern kingdom, a son of David will always sit on the throne. For the northern kingdom, it's going to be several dynasties, right? Jeroboam's going to reign, and then eventually his family line is going to get killed off. Somebody else is going to take over. So the northern kingdom is going to be a bunch of different dynasties, and all of the kings are horrible. The southern kingdom, you're going to have some good ones, but most of them are bad, right? And so the southern kingdom is better, but not much, right? The northern kingdom is just a mess of sin, right? Okay, so God continues. But to his son I will give one tribe, that my servant David may have a lamp always before me in Jerusalem. I love that he keeps saying one tribe, though, because it just emphasizes God's, like, graciousness, right? He's like, I'm going to give you one tribe. And then Jeroboam's like, well, okay, 10 plus 1 is 11. Where's the 12th tribe? Okay, well, I'm going to give that one to David, too, but shh, we don't have to mention that, right? That's God just being gracious, right? I will give him the one tribe, that my servant David may have a lamp always before me in Jerusalem. I love that phrase. May have a lamp always before me in Jerusalem. What is that phrase? Like, a lamp always? What's it talking about?
The light.
The light.
Yeah.
Right? Do you remember way back, like at the end of 2 Samuel, how David talked about himself that way?
He was
Right?
the lamp.
Yeah. I think it was the story about David's retirement.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Do you remember whenever David was out at battle and then somebody had to step in? I forget who it was.
One of the.
It was one of the mighty men.
Yeah.
But one of them steps in and they protect David from a giant. Right? And they say because they're like, they can't lose the light of Israel, the lamp of Israel. Because that's who David is, right? He is the light. Like, metaphorically speaking, he is the light of the world. Right? That's who David is. And David's family is the light of the world. And then if you keep tracking that down the line, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And then Jesus tells us, you are the light of the world. Right? And it all goes back to David. Right? David was the light that started the fire. Right? And so he says, his son will get that tribe, right? So Rehoboam will reign, but his kingdom will be reduced, right? And the burning flame that David started will be reduced to a single spark again, right? For a while, it was this amazing, it was like a menorah, right? It had all this fire, but now it's just going to be a tiny little candle. That my servant David may have a lamp always before me in Jerusalem. Why does David need to have a lamp always before him in Jerusalem?
To show him the way.
Yes. The covenant, right? That's ultimately what I'm getting at. God made a promise. And God doesn't go back on his promises. Man might do it, but when God says yes, he means yes. And when he says no, he means no. And so whatever Solomon does, whatever David does, whatever Rehoboam does, believe me, Rehoboam's not going to be any better than Solomon. He's going to be way worse. He says, there's got to be a lamp in Jerusalem, because that's what I promised. The city where I have chosen for myself to put my name. So it's for the sake of David and Jerusalem. It keeps going back to that. David and Jerusalem. David and Jerusalem. David and Jerusalem. And I will take you. Who's he talking to? Who is the you? Jeroboam. I will take you, Jeroboam, and you shall reign over whatever your soul desires. And you shall be king over Israel. This is why the northern kingdom is going to be called Israel. Right? So Rehoboam is going to be given Judah, and Jeroboam is given Israel. Right? There you have Judah, Israel. That's going to be the names. You shall reign over whatever your soul desires. Dude was just going for a walk in the field. Right? He's like, wow, that's awesome. Then it will be that if you listen to all that I command to you. What do you want to bet that the word for listen there is Shema? I don't know if it is or not. I'm just going to check. It better be. Bada boom, bada bing. Then it will be if you Shema all that I command you. Then it will be that if you Shema to all that I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my sight to keep my statutes and my commandments as my servant David did, I will be with you and build you an enduring house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. So he says, Jeroboam, if you play your cards right, you'll be another David. But do you see how Jeroboam's not even from the house of David, yet he's still being compared to David. That's how amazing David was. It didn't just affect his family line. David was so faithful that he becomes the example for everybody. Whether you're a son of David or whether you're a son of Zeruiah the widow. He says, you need to be like David. If you can be like David, you'll have an enduring house. And it seems to be that his argument is that the kingdom will remain split and Jeroboam will have a covenant just like David's and it will be amazing. But Jeroboam's not going to do it. And so, ultimately, the kingdom will be given back in its entirety to David. I'll build you an enduring house as I built for David, and I'll give Israel to you. And this is pretty cool. Like, this is, like, for Jeroboam, this is an even better promise because he has evidence of God's faithfulness. Because God is saying, I am going to bring David down to nothing, but I'm not going to destroy him because that's how my promises work. And he says, Jeroboam, if you play your cards right, you can have the same thing. To where I'm not saying you won't be brought down to nothing, but your family will reign forever. It's a pretty big promise. And he knows that God's telling the truth because that's what he's literally being employed to go reduce David to basically nothing. I love this verse. Verse 39. Thus I will afflict the seed of David for this, but not always. Those three words have such huge ramifications on human history. Even to this day. The only reason that we are sitting in this room to this day is because of those three words, but not always. Because he says, I'm going to punish David in David's house for what Solomon did. But not always. Because eventually, a shoot will arise from the stump of Jesse. And he will reign over David and his household, and all of Judah, and all of Israel, and over all of the nations forevermore. You, Bethlehem Ephrathah, small amongst the clans of Judah, from you will arise one who will rule over the nations. That's what we're celebrating in Christmas time, right? What a fitting story. Who thought that 1 Kings 11 was a fitting Christmas story? But not always. There's the answer, right? And on it, like, you want me to really show you how much of a Christmas story this is? So he says, where's that? Verse 38. He says, it will be that if you listen to all that I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right with you, right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you. So God promises to be with Jeroboam as he was with David. Well, David already did it, so we know that God is always going to be with David and his household. Right? So I guess you could say that from David's household's perspective, they could say that no matter what happens, God will be with us. What is the word for God with us in Hebrew? Emmanuel. Right? Look at that. Why don't we talk about this passage every Christmas time? Right? He's saying, Jeroboam, if you play your cards right, Emmanuel. Right? You'll be able to say Emmanuel just as much as David. But Jeroboam's not going to play his cards right. And so instead, it's going to be the house of David that is crying out, O come, Emmanuel. Right? Thus I will afflict the seed of David for this, but not always. Eventually, the time of David's judgment will come to an end, and one from the house of David will arise to rule over the nations. Verse 40. Solomon sought, therefore, to put Jeroboam to death. So apparently, even though this was a secretive moment that only Jeroboam was supposed to know about, he wasn't totally David-like from the very beginning. Right? David seemed to keep the promise to himself. What did Jeroboam do?
Told Solomon?
He went and told everybody, apparently. I doubt that he walked up to Solomon and said, hey, Solomon, apparently I'm going to replace you. I doubt he did that. But apparently he told enough people for it to get back to Solomon so that Solomon sought to put him to death. Kind of like how Pharaoh sought to put Moses to death after that. And how Saul sought to put David to death. And how Saul was even more furious as he heard the people saying, Saul's killed his thousands, David's killed his 10 of thousands. And as he got even more furious whenever he started hearing that people thought David might one day be king. So once again, Solomon's becoming Saul-like. Solomon sought therefore to put Jeroboam to death, but Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and he was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So, like David before him, Jeroboam gets up and he flees away from the new Saul until the death of Saul. And then once Saul dies, Jeroboam is going to return and he's going to establish his kingdom. And it's reversal. Remember whenever David first established his kingdom after Saul died? Did David immediately take over the entire nation? No. What did he become king over?
Hebron.
Judah, right? Yeah. Hebron was the capital of Judah, right? So David became king of Judah, and who became king of the rest of Israel? It was Saul's son. Remember? Ishbosheth. Well, now it's a reversal of it, right? Because now you've got Jeroboam, the new David, who's going to become the king of the rest of Israel, while Solomon, the new Saul, has a son named Rehoboam who reigns over Judah. Right? So it's literally a reversal of the story. Right? To where Jeroboam gets the greater portion. Right? Jeroboam is in the place of David, but he's reigning over the place that Ishbosheth reigned over. It's really cool. Let me read what this guy says. Like Saul and David, Jeroboam is a valiant warrior, a potentially royal figure. Jeroboam faithfully served Solomon, a rising star of the royal administration. The original pattern for this scenario comes from the story of Joseph, but this is refracted through the story of David, who faithfully served Saul. Jeroboam meets a prophet from Shiloh, who tells him that he will be king. David is anointed by Samuel, a prophet who grows up with Eli in Shiloh. Ahijah symbolizes the tearing of the kingdom by tearing a new cloak that he wears. Similarly, the kingdom taken away from Saul is symbolized by the torn robe of Saul. Once Solomon finds... actually, it should be the torn robe of Samuel. He just typoed there. Once Solomon finds that Jeroboam has been designated as his successor, he attempts to kill him, just as Saul attempts several times to kill the anointed prince, David. The promises to Jeroboam are similar to the promises that Yahweh made to David. Right? And so once again in this story, Solomon is the new Saul. Right? And so the reason you're given these backstories is because you're seeing Israel's story repeated, but unfortunately in each of these stories, Solomon comes out as the bad guy. Solomon is either the new Canaan or twice the new Saul. Either way, his kingdom's going to be conquered and his kingdom's going to be torn away from him. And so, final 3 verses. Could you read those for us?
Now the rest of the acts of Solomon and whatever he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? Thus the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of his father David. And his son Rehoboam became king in his place.
Very good. There's the death of Solomon. Really sad. We don't really get to see much else of what Solomon did. Right? He reigned for 40 years, but the remainder of his reign is just summarized by failure. It's like, wow, I wonder what the wisest man in the earth accomplished with his reign. Well, after he built the temple, all that he really did was multiply women, multiply horses, and multiply money. Oh. I guess I don't need to know what else he did in his reign. Summary. What did Solomon do with his reign after he dedicated the temple? Turned away from God and failed. Oh. Awesome. Right? So it's really sad. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, whatever he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? Well, there's an understood answer to this question. And what is the answer? It's just yes or no.
Yes.
Yes, right? The answer is yes. Do we have access to this book, the Acts of Solomon?
Yes.
No, we actually don't. We have no access to this. Presumably, this is just some record that Solomon had kept during his reign. Right? We don't have access to it. It apparently was not divinely inspired. I'm assuming that it was probably kept in the temple, and that when the temple was destroyed, that book was also destroyed. Right? But apparently, even after the temple was destroyed, this was a book that was still accessible to the Israelites at that time period. Right? Maybe it was destroyed whenever the Romans destroyed the temple. I don't know. Eventually, that book was destroyed, and we don't have access to it. But there are other cultures and stuff that do have traditions regarding Solomon. And even the Jewish people do have other stories about Solomon and their traditions. Maybe that's handed down from this book. I don't know. But we don't have access to it. But at that time period, they did. Right? The author's just saying, Solomon did a bunch of other stuff, but it's not significant to our story. It's very similar to in the Gospel of John, whenever John says, Jesus did many other things, but these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, Son of God. Right? And the author's going to do this several times. Right? He's going to say, as for the other things that the king did, if you want to read about those, go read the Annals of the Kings of Israel. You don't need to know that. He's basically admitting, I'm telling you selective details to communicate the story that I'm trying to communicate. Right? So he says, that's all you need to know about Solomon in order to accomplish what I'm trying to get across in my story. Right? I just like that the authors do that, because it lets you know that they do have an agenda. Right? There is an overall message here. They're not simply just writing down random details. The details that they are sharing are significant to this story and the message they're communicating. Right? That's reassuring to me. The guy isn't just writing down random history. He has an end goal here. So he says, if you want to know more about him, go read that other book. As for my book, it's time to move on to Rehoboam. The rest of the Acts of Solomon, whatever he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? Yes. Thus, the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. This is going to be a structure that we're going to see for pretty much the rest of the book. It's going to say, as for the other acts, are they not written here? Yep. Thus, all the days that they reigned was this time period. So, he reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel. Unfortunately, we're not going to see anybody reigning over all Israel again. Right? They're going to reign over Judah, they're going to reign over Israel, but they're not going to reign over all Israel together. He reigns for 40 years, from 970 BC to 930 BC. Unfortunately, with his death is going to come the end of the United Kingdom of Israel, the United Monarchy. Right? It's only going to last 120 years. Right? It's going to start with King Saul in 1050 BC. He reigns from 1050 to 1010 BC. David reigns from 1010 BC to 970 BC. Solomon reigns from 970 BC to 930 BC. Right? So they each reign roughly 40 years, as best we can tell. David and Solomon were for sure 40 years. Saul, we're not totally sure, but we think it's roughly that time. They each reigned 40 years, and then it comes to an end with Solomon. And Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of his father David, and his son Rehoboam became king in his place. Whenever it says slept with his fathers, I'll just remind you that that's like a literal sleeping with the fathers in the sense of he dies and that his bones would eventually be collected in an ossuary that were then put alongside the bones of David and stuff like that. And so there's the death of Solomon. Really sad. Y'all have anything y'all want to add to this before we just kind of wrap up?
Don't be like Solomon.
Don't be like Solomon. Yeah. Just an FYI, there's going to be one easy application point that I can teach you just going forward for the rest of 1st and 2nd Kings. If you want to remember this as we go into the new year. Every week, if we're looking for application, it's be like David, and usually it's going to be don't be like the king we're currently talking about. There are going to be some exceptions, but by and large, it's be like David, don't be like this guy. Like that's going to be the general application. Yes?
I was going to say that.
Okay. So application-wise, look at David in the story. Ironically, David is dead, but he's still living on through his faith. Right? That's really cool. It's kind of like whenever it said, whenever God confronted Cain and said that your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. Right? In that instance, the blood was testifying against Cain's guilt. And that's kind of what David's is doing right here too. Right? David's faithfulness is testifying against everybody else's unfaithfulness, even from his death. Right? Because David is an example of the fact that you actually can't do this. Right? That's the crazy thing about David. Right? When we look at Jesus, we have to realize that Jesus was a level of perfection that none of us can achieve in this life. Mm-hmm. David, though, that's a different story. David proves to us that it is possible to be a man or woman after God's own heart. And so, going forward, David's the standard, right? And that means that all of us, right, even us in this room, right, it's not just the descendants of David. Jeroboam is not a descendant of David, yet he is being compared to David. So all of us in this room, even to this day, the question is, are we going to be like David? The cool thing is that we have a greater son of David who gives us an even higher standard, but we can't achieve his standard, right? That's the whole point of why he came, right? We needed Jesus because we couldn't be Jesus. But we can be David, and if we try hard enough, we can even surpass David, right? I mean, if you have a heart like David and you get through life without, like, sleeping with one of your best friend's wives and having the best friend killed, well, there you go. You surpassed David. So David showed us that it's possible. And that's really going to be the story of 1st and 2nd Kings, right? What's really cool is that really Samuel and Kings are David's story because the story of the people of Israel is the story of David. It's just always, it's anticipating David and looking back at David. David is the standard until Jesus shows up. And that's why everybody's always calling him the son of David, right? David is, like, you have to understand, like, why he's so significant. Be like David. Not like me, David, right? But now you understand why I feel so honored to share names with him, right? David's such a cool dude, right? I hope that, like whenever I think of my name, I'm like that's motivation to live like him. Like, it's like I literally share names with him. It's like, dang, don't want to muddy up that name. Because he's a cool dude. All right. So there is Bible study for the year. I hate to end on such a sour note, but don't worry. Even though David's household might not always be faithful, God is always faithful. And God will be with David. And as we're going to be celebrating with the birth of the virgin-born son of David, God is with us, right? Emmanuel. And so in this Christmas season, we'll be singing O Come, Emmanuel. That's the same thing that Solomon's children will be crying out every year going forward, right? Maranatha, come Lord, come Lord, come Lord. O come, Emmanuel. And ransom captive Israel. We'll be talking about that story starting in January, but we can still share in the longing of it going into this Christmas season. One of y'all want to close this out in prayer?
I can.
Go for it.
Father God, thank you for allowing us to be here to go through your word. Don't allow us to come out of this place unchanged. Let your word not fall to the ground. Allow our hearts to be changed, and that we would not just dedicate our works to you, but we would dedicate ourselves to you. That we would present ourselves as a living sacrifice, and that we would reflect that in the way that we conduct our lives. Let us not be unchanged, and let us live for you. Let us be a part of the solution this world needs. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.